What's going on, guys? Dr. Andrew Fix back for another episode here on The Code, sitting inside of Lions Den Strength, Mobility, Performance with my buddy Tristan Mitchell. He is one of the two owners here, and you guys have heard him on this podcast before. So, Tristan, thanks for joining me again for another episode, man.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so last time that you were on this show, we talked about Lions Den. We talked kind of about your background, how you got into running, how you got into training, and why you decided to open a facility of your own. But even though we did that on that previous episode, would you do me a favor and just kind of give a real brief introduction of yourself again, in case people didn't listen to that, and then we will dive in deeper on running, strength training, and we'll get into it a little bit.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So so my background, running is kind of my passion from a performance standpoint, and I've been running marathons now since I was 20 years old, which is 17 years ago somehow now. So been doing a decent amount of running, and I've run 24 marathons. So that's kind of been the pursuit from a performance standpoint, and it kind of drew me into the fitness space as far as my profession was concerned. And so I got a job over at a gym not too far away from here, started kind of at the ground floor there, and eventually became a trainer. Trained there for many years before I left to open my own thing with my wife. So she's the we all joke around here, but she's the real boss around here. I just work here, but yeah. So so we've Lions Den's now been in existence for we're coming up to 5 years, which is pretty crazy. So some ups and downs over the years, and obviously COVID was weird, but we're still here, and that's awesome. So yeah, in a nutshell, I'd say running kind of led me to training as a profession, and and that eventually led me to here. So
yeah, and I've been fortunate to have kind of met you like halfway through that Lions Den journey. If we're closing in on 5 years, it's basically been 2.5 that I have lived here in the Denver area, and been here inside the gym. And as soon as you and I had this running thing in common, though I have not run 24 marathons, I've run exactly 0 marathons, as a matter of fact, but a couple halves and shorter races. But a passion of yours has pretty much turned into like a fuel for your business too, because obviously you enjoy running, but you also end up working with and enjoy working with a lot of running athletes in your training business. So when was it that you started to see your like clientele from a personal training and coaching perspective start to take the shape of like, I'm working with a lot of people that are just like me, like to do the same thing that I do?
I mean, I would say honestly, really kind of right out of the gate. I think, as I started, when I started personal training, the first, I'd say, by the time I had kind of a dozen regular clients, a decent percentage of them were some sort of endurance-based athlete. A lot of them actually early on were triathletes. There was a pretty strong community of triathletes at the gym that I used to work at. Yeah. And so some of them I would work with very directly as their trainer, and others more kind of indirectly as just, meeting and running with them, becoming friends with a lot of those guys, which then kind of opened doors to other people. So I would say, honestly, I mean, to answer your question, early on, and then now, obviously, I'm very fortunate to get to work with a local high school here. You and I both work with a lot of those young athletes. My niece is obviously a very high level high school runner and going on to run Division I. And her, and beginning to work with her, and then obviously with my friend Simon Scorsia, who you've had on the podcast, and he and I over the years have worked with adult clientele from a marathon standpoint. So we've done training programs for kind of your recreational runners to more competitive adult runners to kind of jointly working together in different capacities with some of the high school or with the high school program that we are both affiliated with over at Rapo. So so I mean, I think early on, and I think it's kind of been a constant, it's never been like all of my clientele though. And it's honestly never been something that I wanted to be all of my clientele.
Sure.
Like I've never wanted to just solely be a running coach and that's it. You know, I only work with runners. I love working with runners, but I also like working with people who aren't runners.
Yeah.
And I like working with people who are, you know, not athletes. So,
You know, it's interesting that you say that, because I think I have a lot of similarities to what you just said, where when I was in high school and I was starting to, you know, think about what I wanted to do, and then I started going down this path of, oh, I'm going to go into physical therapy school, kind of fueled by, you know, my own injury, and then my dad going through some shoulder stuff, and I got to do some shadowing with his physical therapist. And I always had this, you know, thought that I wanted to work in a sports setting. I wanted to be like the physical therapist for a professional sports team. And then while I was going through physical therapy school on my internships and stuff, I started to realize that I didn't only enjoy working with athletes. I enjoyed working with all different types of people. And quite frankly, athletes are a little bit of a pain to work with sometimes, because they're very high demand clientele. Like they're very particular, very needy in certain situations. There's a little bit more back end work sometimes that goes into working with higher level athletes. And then I started to, you know, learn that a lot of times the opportunities that you get are way less about what you know and way more about who you know. Most of the providers that are working for these like elite clubs and teams and stuff, though they may be brilliant individuals, a lot of times they got that opportunity because of a connection that they had, not just because of the skill set that they have. And I started to find out from some people that had worked in that setting that, man, that is like really demanding and really like owns your life. And it's really hard to, you know, build a life, put down roots, build a family while working in one of those environments. And I started to find that like what I thought my professional goals were didn't match up with what my life goals were. And so I sort of switched gears, and that's how I wound up going down the path for an orthopedic residency out of school instead of a sports residency, because I knew I didn't want to just work with athletes. And that sort of like changed the trajectory of my career. And quite frankly, if I would have gone that sports residency route, we probably wouldn't be sitting here having this conversation.
Yep, totally.
But speaking of Simon, I asked him this question. Well, I asked him a question that I'll ask you in a second, but you've run 24 marathons. When was your first one? And when was your most recent one? And then the question I asked him was like, what race or what city or whatever, like what was your favorite one?
So my first one was in 2006, Denver Marathon. I was 20 years old. I was about a month away from turning 21. And I, you know, it's funny, I try to go back and remember, you know, kind of that whole process leading up to my first marathon, and I don't really remember it at all. As far as like what my mindset was, what my training looked like. I honestly don't remember at all what my training looked like. I know that I was probably running somewhere in the vicinity of like 40 to 50 miles a week, because it was some years until I kind of realized that I needed to get well above 50 miles a week to run the kind of times that I was wanting to run. So I ran that in 2006. You know, there's a very kind of, you know, interesting story around my first marathon, because I was 20 and not knowing what I was doing. And really, you know, did not set myself up for success the night before. Went out for dinner at a local pizza place that I loved. Went to an ice cream shop nearby and had a bunch of ice cream. And I was kind of like just in this mindset of, I am going to go burn a ton of calories tomorrow, and I need a lot of calories to fuel that. Not really kind of thinking at all where those calories were coming from. You know, being 20 years old. I had run, numerous half marathons at that point, and I had gone under I don't know what my half marathon PR was at the time, but I know it was under 130. Going into the race, I had no like strong time goal, I remember, but I knew that I could like run reasonably fast. Just through kind of local shorter races. So going out there, you know, I kind of, you know, didn't have a huge amount of direction. My dad is a marathoner, former marathoner. He's run, I think, over a dozen or so marathons, and he had a PR of 3:16, or still has a PR of 3:16, which I, was, I think, probably in my head thinking like, okay, I want to try to take that down.
Gotta beat dad.
And get out there. The morning of, I realized that my stomach was not in great shape because of the decisions that I made the night before. My dad kind of had a laugh at the fact that I had a bunch of ice cream, not really connecting the obvious dots of, eating a bunch of dairy prior to going and running, first thing in the morning. So, needless to say, I had to take some bathroom breaks throughout that marathon. I ended up hitting, I think it was four bathroom breaks, I think, through that marathon. And kind of comically, my old man was on a bike for the entire race, basically, and he would like ride ahead. He loves to tell the story, but he would like literally ride ahead.
Scope out.
Like make sure he could like reserve a door for me, essentially. And I'd be in and out as quick as I could. And I remember the last one, I exit, my dad kind of laughs and he's like, well, this certainly has been entertaining today. And I'm like, God. And he's like, and he makes some comment, to the effect of the kind of household marathon time was going to be safe for at least one more year. And I end up running a 3:19. And I remember thinking, well, that was a total disaster. And
not bad with 4 bathroom breaks.
Yeah. I mean, it wasn't, I mean, it definitely could have been slower. And I think, who knows what I could have run had I been more prepared. But anyway, it motivated me to come back the next year. So in 2007, I come back. I was in better shape. I had a much better mindset. I really, went into that race with a very definitive goal of sub 3 hours. We had pouring rain, about 40 degrees. It was a classic kind of October day in Denver where it was, cold, sleeting rain, but not cold enough to turn it over to snow, which would have been dramatically better because you were so wet.
Yep.
And it was a total slog. I remember that marathon way more than I remember my first one. And I remember crossing the line. I ran 2:53 and change, and I crossed the line and I got handed a water bottle, and I literally couldn't unscrew the little plastic water bottle because my hands and arms were so numb. And I remember just tears going down my face and not really realizing why, or like not like really kind of consciously knowing why I was crying. But there was a sense of kind of euphoria with the accomplishment of that marathon. I think the combination of the elements, the weather that we battled, and the time that I ran was kind of all combined to a very emotional moment for me. And at the time I was 21, so about a month away from turning 22. So it was a year later. Those races were in October. And then, that was it, man. Like after that, I realized that I was hooked and that I really liked marathons. I ran, like I said, another 22. I've never run slower than that second one. So I've run some low 250s, but then, have now worked my way down to 236 and change at Chicago in 2019. And that story, that was an interesting race. And I was 33. That was 2019. That was my last marathon. And that race was very meaningful to me because my prior PR was a 2:37:09, and I had run it at my 13th marathon at Denver in 2012, was it 2013? Something quite a few years earlier.
Sure, yeah. So
and
10 years, basically.
Yeah.
Right?
So I went.
10 marathons. I mean,
yeah, it was
10 marathons.
Yeah, it was 10 marathons, and I remember, at the time when I ran that 2:37:09, I ran it at Denver. And honestly, if you compared the two races,
sure,
the Denver race is probably, not probably, the Denver race is the better of the two races because my
the fast time at elevation.
At elevation, and the course was much more difficult than Chicago. So the Denver race was probably the better of the two races, but I think at the time I did not view it as my ceiling. I viewed it as being a time that I would continue to improve upon. And then my subsequent marathons, I proceeded to run 3 more 237s, all slower than that one, but 237 in some seconds. I ran a couple 238s, I ran 239s. So I got very close, but I just never could beat that time. And that was really frustrating. And also kind of eye-opening in the sense that unless something dramatically was going to change about, at that time, at this point now I'm running, 75 to 95 miles a week, depending on the marathon. I'm a lot more, by the time I'm to Chicago, especially, that last marathon, I am way more savvy from a training standpoint, have far more understanding of just how our bodies work and, and what I need to be doing from a training standpoint. So to kind of know that I was gaining knowledge and experience, but not being able to run a faster time was a tough pill to swallow. And I had numerous good races, but just couldn't quite get there. And, honestly, I think, for me, I race at 170 to 175 pounds, right? So I think ultimately 170 to 175 pound body can only run so fast, like over an extended period. Like at some point, I think as I look around, I see the guys that I am running, racing against or shoulder to shoulder to, a lot of them are a lot smaller than me, right?
Absolutely.
And so I'm like, okay, if I'm going to get considerably faster, weight loss is going to need to be part of this. And, to be perfectly honest, it kind of comes back to just like, what am I doing this for? Like how much is like the pursuit of trying to lose, 10, 12, 15 pounds really worth it for me? From a long-term perspective. And so I just never, I had some races where I got down to mid 160s, I remember, and I had good days there, but nothing, again, nothing faster. And eventually Chicago in 2019, I finally run a 236.51. So I finally beat that 09. And it was very emotionally meaningful for me. I raced at about 173 pounds at that. I was working my tail off that year of 2019. Lions Den was in a particular situation where I was needing to train a lot, or as much as I possibly could, from a work standpoint.
So
I was probably had more training sessions per week than any year that I've ever trained in that year. And I ran, somewhere between, I think if I remember correctly, I had leading up to that marathon, it was like 10 weeks of 80+ mile weeks with 3 or 4 90+ mile weeks. And I knew I had a good training block, and I knew I was in good shape, and I was confident going into race day. And that marathon was a bit of a slugfest because it didn't come to me as not easy, but it didn't come to me as comfortably as I thought it would for the first half. Over the years, I have focused on negative splitting the marathon. That was something, really that Simon, when he and I first became friends many, many years ago, and by that point, maybe I had run a half dozen marathons, or so, that he had really talked to me about kind of the concept of negative splitting. And I had a terrible day. I don't know what year it was, but I had a terrible Denver marathon where I went out. It was the last marathon I know where I only was running about 50 to 55 miles a week for training.
Before you bumped your volume.
Yes, before I bumped my volume up. And anyway, long story short, I went out and I wanted a sub 245. And I remember running at that somewhere around that pace through the first half, essentially blowing up and holding on to like a 248 or 249 or something like that. But I just remember being in total pain the last 6 miles. I'm slowing down mile over mile. I know I'm getting chased, like I'm getting, and I had, at that point really prided myself about not getting passed, especially, after a certain point in a marathon. And I was able to hold off the guys behind me, but it was very frustrating. I think I finished like maybe, I don't know, 8th place, something, 7th, 8th place. But anyway, point being is after that marathon, I remember Simon and I on a run having a conversation and him talking about negative splitting and me realizing that just made a lot of sense. And as I started to increase my volume, going into some subsequent races after that and really starting to execute on the negative split, And then the first time that I went, the first 2:37 I ran was actually a Colfax marathon, where I had a massive negative split. I ran 2:37:30 there, I believe, or 33, can't remember, one of the two. Anyways, I ran a really good race that race, and I ran a huge negative split. And I remember just passing tons of people in the second half, loving that feeling of flying at the end of the race. And that might have been, maybe around marathon 9-10, somewhere in there. So, really kind of learning how to negative split races was huge. And, ever since then, I've, that's something I've really worked at in the marathon, prided myself on. So fast forward 2019 Chicago, I come through halfway, and I realized that I am nowhere near PR pace. I think I ran like a high 119 or something like that. So I had a lot of work to do in the second half. I really get into the mindset. I go into the races, go into marathons really with the mindset of the first half as an extended warm up. So, the idea, essentially I'm running, right around a 6-minute mile. That 2:36 equates to a 5:59 average. So, I'm in that mindset of going out in the vicinity of that pace, but I don't want to be faster than it through the first half. And I honestly don't really want to be right at it through the first half. I want to be
a little off.
I want to be like +5 to maybe 10 seconds is a little bit more than I feel comfortable with, but like 5 to 8 seconds maybe. I definitely had a couple miles where I was more than, I think I had a couple maybe where I got into double digits, maybe 6:10, 6:11 pace, or split. But most of them stayed in that kind of like 6:05 to 6:08 range, and it just wasn't coming as easy as I hoped it would. But over the years, I feel like I've also kind of cultivated a mindset of being able to dig, and just kind of, the way I always got like to think about it is like having these like things that I can draw upon to elicit an adrenaline response. Something that just fires me up. And I save these things for the second half of a marathon. Things that, like, if I think about them when I'm sitting here, will kind of like get the hair standing up on end kind of thing. Things that get me pumped up. And so I hit that second half and I go to that place, right away. And I try to find a rhythm, and I did. And, not to belabor the story any longer, but got into a good rhythm. And chased down a PR and crossed that line and was immensely happy. At the time, it was an 18-second PR. It was 2:36:51. But those 18 seconds were about as sweet as they could be for me, because finally breaking that 2:37:09, like I said, it was meaningful. So that was my last marathon. And you asked me what my favorite marathon was.
Like what was your favorite race? What was your favorite course?
I would say my favorite, so I've run quite a bit of marathons outside of Colorado. I've run a lot of marathons. I've run Denver and Colfax Marathon many times. And then I've run Phoenix a couple times. I've run Vancouver. I've run Toronto. Somehow I got talked into running Des Moines. Thanks Simon for that one. No, Des Moines was actually super fun. But so I ran Des Moines. I've run Chicago. I've run Boston. I've run Berlin. So I've run a decent amount of marathons, kind of outside of Colorado. I would say, honestly, both the Canadian marathons that I've run, Vancouver and Toronto, were both fantastic races, and the courses were amazing. The race that I often think of as kind of having the most fun was probably 2014 Vancouver Marathon. I ran it with a friend of mine, and training partner, gentleman by the name of Kevin Ellis, and he and I ran, basically 22 miles of that race together, and really worked together throughout the entire marathon. He leading 1 mile, me leading another mile. And just the kind of teamwork of those 22 miles made for an unbelievably fun marathon. So that one's really high up there. Berlin would be high up there. So those, I'd say those are probably
Yeah.
course wise, I'd have to say Berlin. There was Berlin was just really cool and a very special race too. And another one of my 237s. That was actually a day where, if I look back, I think that actually I've also run San Diego Marathon twice. I had one race at San Diego and then that race at Berlin in 2017. I would argue that those, I think San Diego was 2013. I think those were probably the two marathons that I went into where I felt like I was the fastest I've ever been.
Yeah.
But just couldn't quite execute on the day.
Well, yeah, and it's interesting because, how you answered that question is probably how I would answer it too. It's not just quite as simple. When you really love something and you really, it's part of your life, it's hard to just say, this is my favorite one.
Yeah.
It's like, well, if I rank my favorite courses, they're in this order, but my favorite cities are in this order. And my, how the whole experience went is in this order. So,
and I'm very partial to the Denver Marathon, which is now gone, unfortunately, but that race was fantastic. And was a great course and hit hit 3 of the major city parks. It was just a really, really cool race.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, for reasons that I only know of through the kind of the rumor mill, but apparently for whatever reason, the city just didn't want to host it anymore. So there's no longer that race, but that was an awesome race as well. So yeah, I mean, like you said, I think there's a lot of things. It's hard to like pick out one. I've got a lot of different memories from, all of them, and some, very few of them are kind of like, were like bad race days.
Yeah, sure.
But I definitely had some. So.
Yeah, and running races has obviously been like a huge part of my life. The practice that I actually used to work for, it is kind of cool employee activity kind of incentive where what they had was you could sign up for up to 5 races a year for up to $100 per race. That would be reimbursed to you if you took a photo of yourself with a company t-shirt.
Oh, that's cool,
right? So, but of course, the primary like company t-shirt that you had was like a cotton t-shirt like I'm wearing now. So what I would always do, because I would never be caught dead like running a race in this, right? So uncomfortable, you get soaked in sweat, is I would never wear that shirt for the race. I would take a photo right beforehand, take that shirt off, boom, right in front of the starting line, and then I would run the race in like more of a singlet type of top. But most of my running experience has come more in like track meet styles, right? Where, I was a cross country runner in middle school, where I would go straight from cross country practice after school, then to out of the school system football practice. My parents were just shuttling me around. But then once high school and college got going, it was like track season and track meets where most of my running. And then it wasn't until after college I started running more 5Ks, 10Ks. And really, I've run 3 half marathons, but I've only run 2 half marathon races because of COVID. One was canceled and I ended up doing a time trial, which that's where the PR is. But it's interesting you bring up this this topic of negative splitting, because though in a much different context than a marathon, I think that's something that a lot of runners struggle with, is going out too hard and not being able to close their race.
Dude, so many.
But that was something that, I probably still deal with now, like that half marathon time trial I ran where my wife, Erin, she was riding a bike next to me, holding a water bottle in a backpack, playing some music. I went out faster than what I was hoping to, because I was just kind of looking at my watch, but I was just kind of running. Went out about 15 seconds per mile faster than my goal was, and then slowed down. But then around mile 11, started paying for that. And the very last mile of the 13.1 was my slowest mile. And I, surpassed my goal, but the last 30 minutes of that was really uncomfortable. The last third of that run. But I even dealt with that in high school and in college. In the 800 meter dash was probably one of the races that I ran the most. I ran a lot of 4x400 relays, where you don't really have that negative splitting piece, but I ran a lot of open 800s. And when I finally started to get better and drop my 800 meter time was when I slowed down my first 400 meter split of my 800, because there were some races where I would go out in like a 56-second 400, but then I would just die at the end of the race. And so I'm talking with my coach and whatnot, and what we decided to do was bring my first 400 meters time down,
Yep.
run a little bit slower,
Yep.
like save a little bit in the tank so that you can close harder. And I remember when I finally was able to just like put the governor on just a little bit, I started to see my PRs drop and drop and drop.
Yep.
From, I think a 201 in high school to a 156 in college. And that was like, kind of interesting. It's like slow down to speed up,
Yep.
basically, right?
Yep.
Otherwise you're blowing your entire energy too much too soon.
Yep.
What do you think, I guess, was like, what was the hardest part for you in that process of like learning how to control what you're doing in the first half of the race so that you could do that negative split? Because, like conceptually, it doesn't seem hard. Oh, you're following your watch and whatnot. But, it takes a lot of mental effort if you are just like totally locked into your watch the entire time when you're running. You don't want to be looking at your watch every 2 minutes.
Yeah.
So what do you think was like the challenge for you to learn how to do that?
Yeah. I mean, I think a couple of things that come to mind as you're talking there too. I think the marathon, the longer the race, I would say kind of in some ways it's easier to me to negative split a longer race than a shorter race. And honestly, I think, there's more wiggle room. Exactly. You have way more bandwidth and time to make up for starting off slower. And I think, generally the argument around slower races, right, shorter races is that, when you're talking about like kind of 5Ks and under, there's really not a benefit to trying to negative split. It's really, trying to run, it's running hard and it's doing it in a way that you don't give too much back as the race goes on, right?
Yeah.
So I think, point B, but either way, there's a lot of it is understanding how to pace, right? And in two very different ways. So I think in the marathon, the hardest part is to know that you are running slower than your goal race pace for a hour plus, like the whole first half of the marathon. To me, or at least for me, and generally not for everybody I coach, but for most people that I coach, I want them to run that slower than goal race pace. And I definitely don't want anybody running faster in the first half than goal race pace. So, so I think just knowing that you're kind of like, oh man, like each mile ticks by and you look down, you're like, oh man, like my goal is to run 6-minute miles or, like I said, or 5:59 mile, it's like, and that mile was a 6:08. My next mile is a 6:07. And, it's like, yes. And you just start, it gets into your head like, oh man, like, but I think, again, you get enough experience in it and you realize that you've got plenty of time to make that up, in the second half of a marathon. And really a marathon is all about, it's energy partitioning, right? Like, I mean, it is making sure that you have enough, you have enough glucose still you have enough glucose in the system as far as you have enough liver glycogen left in the system to pull from late in the race.
Yeah.
And that you've got, your nutrition strategy in the race is going to, also obviously play a role in what's available. Especially if you want to be running, like for me in the second half of marathons, I want to be running, like high 540s, low 550s, right? So, so at that point, if I don't have that energy storage left, and I don't have the right nutrition strategy, and hydration strategy in place, then that's not going to happen, right? So I mean, I think part of it is just understanding that if you go out too hard, you just simply burn up too much of your, stored carbohydrates. So, and I think that's really kind of where the wall, quote unquote, comes into play, right? As people talk about hitting the wall, it's like, to me, the wall just means that you ran dumb, you ran too fast and you have nothing left. There's, you're flat out of stored glycogen at that point. And the only glucose you're going to be getting is going to be coming in through, goos and hydration, Gatorade or whatever it might be. And that's not going to be enough to keep you running fast. And so your body's going to ultimately put the regulator on. It's going to force you back into more of an aerobic state. Well, even I guess you're always going to be in an aerobic state at that kind of distance, but that percentage gain is going to shift, right?
Sure.
Your access to speed is going to start to dissipate.
Yeah.
And then you couple that with the breakdown that's happening within the muscle. and the nervous system. There's so much fatigue on the body at that point. The pain is setting in. So, you combine all these things and it leads to a really shitty final 10K for most people in the marathon. And they kind of view that as the wall. And like I said, I view that as being bad race strategy. If you're dying and slowing down the last 10K, well, then you ran too fast. I always kind of get a laugh out of, just people who kind of talk about, well, I ran, at mile 18, I was on pace for blah, blah, blah. It's like, well, but it's a 26.2 mile race. So who cares what pace you were on at mile 18?
I was leading, we were leading the football game when the fourth quarter started.
Exactly.
Well, there's still 25% left.
I mean, I could go blow myself out in the first round and be like, I was on Kipchoge's pace, through mile 1, and then the wheels fell off and I, was dead. So it's like, it's just like, the race is 26.2, right? So it's like, you've got to learn how to pace appropriately. And I think, and then, to me, being able to scale that downwards into shorter races, and the need for pacing is different, right? Because you're not going to worry about energy storage. You're really going to learn, what you're really going to have to worry about is the buildup of various, metabolites as you are running really hard, right? So if you're racing in an 800, you've got to worry about hydrogen ion buildup in the muscle cell, right? That's going to start to bleed away at your ability to fire muscle effectively. And, that's that heavy dead-legged, what often gets attributed to lactic acid, right? Lactic acid, we produce lactic acid. It is actually a really efficient energy source for the body, that we're very good at recycling. But a byproduct of that metabolism is hydrogen ion, and that builds up in the muscle cell, and that eventually erodes your capacity for high output. So if you go out and run really hard in a mile, which you and I both are familiar with, that first year that we met, we got to go run a fast mile around the track. You get to feel what real pain is of that buildup, right? What that feels like, and you can see why that pain will shut you down early if you do not pace correctly, right? If you go too hard in the first 800, you will not achieve the time that you want to race in the second 800 if that effort's too hard, right? So it's that fine line of pushing right up to the edge, but not going over, right? For sure. And I think that's the thing of shorter races is it's pushing right up to the edge, and you might go over just at the end, but you need to go over late enough that finish line is close enough, really close, exactly. Because if it's only halfway, it's game over. So I would say from a pacing standpoint, the marathon, the hardest part, negative splitting a marathon, is your own mind and what your mind's telling you, because you're not really in pain in the first half either. That's the other thing, is that you feel good, right? So you're 10K.
It's hard to hold back.
You're 10K into a marathon. Everybody's, running, like bats out of hell. Everybody's caught up in the adrenaline. And, for me, it's like, I'm trying to find my zen, like I'm just trying to relax. I'm trying to feel good. I'm trying to feel smooth. I'm not thinking about a race yet. Like I said, I think about that first half as a warm up to the race that starts at halfway. And then, like I said, you get down into these shorter races, and you got to just learn how to hurt, and you got to learn how to ride that fine line. Pacing is going to be different. It may not necessarily be negative splitting, but a lot of it is discipline around what you're willing to tolerate physically and mentally, and making sure that you understand what your body's capable of.
Yeah, for sure. And, it's funny that you say, like, people will tell the story of, oh, I was on pace for X, Y, and Z 18, 20 miles in, and then I hit the wall, then I bonked or whatever. And it's like, no matter how much they want the solution to why that happens to be like right there. The problem happened a long time before that, right? The problem either happened before that in that race, or in their training block, or in eating ice cream the night before, right? Like the problem wasn't mile 20. It was all of the stuff that compounded before that.
Or an overestimate. Exactly. And that stuff kind of compounding in a way that allows you to overestimate your capacity, which I have 100% been guilty of before in a marathon. I mean, the day that I blew up was the day that I overestimated my capacity, right? I went in, I have a decent amount of memory around that training block, and I won't bore you with that story, but I went in doing some things a little differently around my long run and my tempo runs, and I really felt like they were translating, and they weren't. And I completely overestimated what my capacity was, and I paid a heavy price that day. And I do remember, I mean, I remember very distinctly, and this is probably like, maybe 2009 or 10. I mean, so this is quite some time ago. And I remember those last few miles just being in an immense amount of pain and realizing that I really screwed up that race, and holding on for dear life to the finish line. And that's a shitty feeling in a marathon. So, and unfortunately, what's kind of, crazy is I've worked with enough people to realize that there's a lot of people that run every single marathon of their life like that. Like, every marathon they've ever run, they go out and they just suffer, in a slowing way to the finish line. Now, don't get me wrong, even with a negative split, I'm suffering, but I'm still running fast. You know what I mean? Like, so there's a difference between suffering and still performing, and suffering and realizing that your performance is out the window. And now, all you're doing is trying to hold on to the finish line. Those are two different feelings. And I've been at both. So,
well, that's a feeling that doesn't feel good, not just from a physical pain standpoint, but from a mental standpoint. It's totally different if you're suffering and performing well. Mentally, you're still kind of like fired up. If you're looking at your watch and you're like, hell yes, that's a time I want to see.
You're getting that positive reinforcement, right?
Versus seeing it add time each mile. You're slowing down as you go,
and you're giving time back. Which even in good races where I have negative split, I've gone a little too aggressive, and I've had races where the last mile or 2 miles I've ended up giving. Berlin's an example of this, where I blasted through so much of the second half of that race, and I was running. I mean, at points in that race, I was running, like low to mid 540s through much of the second half. And the last 2 miles, I started to slip, and I run I believe I ran like a 6 minute, maybe like a 6:08. Last mile, and which doesn't sound dramatically slower, but you think about that versus 5:42, and that's
30 plus.
There you go. So,
well, and you sort of mentioned this a little bit ago when you were talking about, well, I usually race in the low 170 pounds range. And I don't remember the exact statistic, but like you said, most endurance runners weigh much less than that, right? Even if they're taller than you or taller than me. Like, I was always the biggest guy in my 800-meter races. There were people that were taller than me, but they weren't as wide as I am. And even more so when we start talking about longer distances like the marathon. I forget exactly what the time is, if it's 6 seconds or if it's 2 seconds or what the statistic is. But there's some metric out there that pretty much says, for every pound of body mass that you have, you run like 2 seconds slower per mile. And but one of the ways that you can try to combat that is to have your body mass be more comprised of muscle, as opposed to having added weight on your frame that's not producing movement. So I kind of view you as like, you're basically like a hybrid athlete, right? You maintain muscle mass, but yet still do endurance stuff. You still do power producing activities, resistance training and things. But one thing that I know, if you're running 90 miles a week, and some of these running endurance athletes or triathletes are putting in hours and hours worth of endurance training on a weekly basis, strength training is not always part of the equation, right? I know a lot of runners, I get the opportunity to work with them, though I don't enjoy that they're hurting. I work with a lot of runners that have running related injuries. And I ask them what they do outside of running, and oftentimes the answer is nothing. No mobility work, no strength training. So let's start to dive into that topic a little bit. And has strength training, and I remember when you started to get into fitness, you were lifting weights. But during your endurance running career, during your marathon running career, has strength training always been a component of your training regimen? And why do you think so many running athletes or endurance athletes are not necessarily participating in strength training? And let's start talking on that a little bit.
A couple thoughts there. I've always kind of wondered how accurate that whole idea of like, for every 1 pound of body weight you lose. Because I've read that as well.
Probably a very big generalization.
Right. And I always kind of wonder, like, okay, well, what does that mean in relation to like proportional strength and, and things like that. Right. So I do think obviously going in, not carrying around, too much excess body fat is obviously going to be advantageous to performance, right? So like that, that's that I think is kind of the that's going to be obviously widely accepted. Then from there, how much muscle mass. I mean, obviously the thing with muscle mass is it has to be fed, right? So it's like,
it's expensive.
It's expensive, yeah, metabolically, right? So if you're racing, even if you're, it's like whatever muscle mass you're carrying, in your upper body, even though your upper body's not necessarily obviously doing a ton of work in a marathon, it's still, muscle that your body has to fuel, right? So, obviously there's always an equation, there's always a part of the process there is going to be, just strength, lean muscle mass, body fat. How much does strength kind of cancel out that weight on the scale kind of thing, right? And I don't know the exact answers to it. I know that strength training has always been important to me. And that kind of goes back to, the early years of me getting into fitness, and not to dive down this rabbit hole, but just, basically, I was not a runner in my younger, growing up as a young kid, I was highly active. I got away from being active, kind of moving into latter part of middle school and into the first part of high school. And, really became sedentary and kind of fat, and just not a really healthy kid. And so as I started to get into fitness, the aesthetics aspect of it was important to me, because I was not confident in my body, and not confident in, myself in a lot of ways, because of how I physically looked and how I felt. So I say all that because that early on in my early 20s in particular was a big part of why I weightlifted. I didn't weightlift because it was improving my running, or even something that I felt like I needed to do to run.
Yeah.
I did it because I wanted to look good with my shirt off, and I didn't want to be a skinny runner. So like, I wanted to have muscle. And so, that those things being important to me were why I kind of lifted. And then as I got older and learned more, I realized that lifting wasn't about just, kind of looking, muscular, but it was about, being able to utilize it in a way that was going to benefit my lifting. And my lifting today looks dramatically different than it did, in my late teens as I was getting into it, and in my early 20s, and really through my mid 20s. Probably it wasn't until my latter half of my 20s that I started to, kind of go down the path that I'm on now, and starting that kind of journey, of using lifting to build a more robust body as a whole, to translate that to running, right? So like, one of the things that I always say to the runners that I work with is, I don't necessarily argue that lifting directly translates to making you a better runner. Now, I do think that being proportionally strong is important, and that probably can help you be a better runner to some degree. I don't know the exact, I don't know exactly how much, right? And it probably varies on the individual. You look at some very famous strength coaches, like people like Ryan Flaherty, who worked with Meb when Meb won Boston. Ryan talked about this many years ago on various podcasts, about making Meb essentially as proportionally strong as possible. And he had a very distinct kind of approach and methodology to that. A lot of which, I have tried to emulate with the runners that I work with, and myself as well. And, the idea essentially is gain proportional strength. So create better efficiencies from a strength standpoint, but not looking to put on muscle mass, right? And I haven't put on muscle mass in years. I mean, I've, essentially looked the same now for, I don't know, like probably since I was like 24, like I've looked pretty similar, 23, 24 years old. I don't think my body's changed that much aesthetically. But I'm stronger now than I was then in a total body sense. And so my point is proportionately I've gotten stronger, my deadlift stronger, my squat stronger, etc. These kind of compound movements that are going to display my body's ability to move weight, in a very organized fashion. And to me, that is going to then help build that proportional strength. Now, that proportional strength, I think, has a benefit to speed and performance. And then on top of that, and I think probably the most important aspect of strength training is, when it comes to running, is strength training. Like I said, it builds a more robust body. So it builds a body that can tolerate the demands of running training more effectively. Caveat, if the strength training is utilized and done in an appropriate manner, right?
Sure.
So to me, I want strength training to restore the body from running, not to further its breakdown from running, right? So, and what I mean by that is, I think there are most runners, to your point, or many runners, to your point, don't do any strength training at all, or they do really strength training that, no offense to these people, but just doesn't do anything, right? Like it's, it's very, very lightweight. It's very, very high rep. It's things that, not that there's not maybe some point of that stuff like that can be part of your strength training program, but if you're not getting your body under some substantial load, then to me, you're not getting that restorative quality of lifting. And that's where using, appropriate training percentages from how much weight you're lifting, how many reps, the volume in particular is, wildly important in my opinion, especially when you get into a, closer to performance. So whether it's a marathon, you're getting closer to a race day, or if it's working with cross-country athletes and they're in the season, how much volume, how much strength training are they doing in season versus out of season? How do we approach that? And then another thing that we work on here immensely at Lions Den is movement quality, right? And that really is kind of born out of me finding Kelly Starrett and becoming a supple leopard, way back when that book first came out. And that was really that was kind of the start for me of reorganizing the way that I thought about strength training, right? So in here, and for myself, we really focus on high movement quality and how movement quality itself translates to running, which is a whole nother aspect of this, which we're probably running out of time, but that's a whole nother part of conversation that we can have maybe another time. And then, like I said, the proportional strength and then the restorative nature of lifting when used appropriately, right? So by that, I mean, running takes a massive toll on the system. It's highly repetitive in a very restricted range of motion. It's hard from a, there's not a lot of, it's a taker in a lot of ways from a hormonal standpoint, especially when your volume's high. And there's a lot of hard efforts in your weeks and your months. So, lifting, as we all know, is very beneficial for a, positive hormonal response. So using lifting to help elicit those responses, making sure that we're supporting ourselves nutritionally is obviously a huge part of this conversation as well.
For sure.
But yeah, so I mean, I think that's kind of where I think the strength training is, using some compound movements. The real approach that I use is compound movements for overall strength. And we've got a couple different tactics and approaches that we use with those, depending on where athletes are in their training block or whether they're in season. Again, kind of taking some from, the various gurus of this stuff, the Jedi masters, as I call them, in our field, the stuff that I've learned over the years, using various tactics and approaches there, training stability. So making sure that our, athletes understand what stable positions are, getting runners out of their shoes. That's another huge part of this conversation. So getting bottom of the chain mechanics, really, understood, strong, connected to the ground, etc. We didn't even, we've talked about weight and body weight and how that might translate to racing. Now you've got the super shoe movement, which, I've yet to race in a super shoe, but at some point maybe I will. And I'm curious what they feel like, because, they're, apparently, they obviously have done amazing things to the world record. So, point being is you've got these other, kind of things at play, right? So, but in here, we're going to get people out of their shoes, and work on that from a strength training standpoint. And then some sort of speed component, something that's going to connect the kinetic chain that's not super technically demanding. I don't think young runners, or any runners maybe, unless it is a goal of theirs to learn how to do, more complicated technical lifts with a barbell, really need to be doing, complicated barbell lifts, like I think if they can squat and they can do the various, versions of squatting and they can deadlift proficiently with a barbell, that's probably all they need to do. And we can check the speed box with things like kettlebells with way less technical demand that are still going to connect a lot of that kinetic chain aspect and get that motor control, doing the things that we want it to do, without having to get over that hurdle of learning the movement skill that is some more complex barbell movements. Which, by the way, I think barbell movements are, we watched two very proficient individuals in our gym.
Yeah, for sure.
And you're pretty damn proficient, and I love playing around with it, but I'm not that good at it, but I like playing around with, power cleans and hang cleans and things like that. And there might be some athletes where that's appropriate. Some runners where that's appropriate based on what their movement mechanics look like. But for a lot of people, I think there's no point in rushing them to that.
Yeah.
I think we can check that box with things that are less technically demanding. So I think if we touch on strength, stability, and a little bit of speed, we do it in a barefoot environment, so we're building a strong foundation, then, we're checking a lot of boxes, doing a lot of good.
Well, I think sort of what you're saying, and I forget exactly how long ago it was relative to when this podcast will air, but I did a shorter episode on strength training for runners, where I sort of talked about some of that stuff. But I think kind of what you're touching on is, let's not replicate the exact same energy systems, neurological effects that you're doing in your distance endurance effort running in your strength training.
It turns out you already have a lot of capacity for high rep if you're a runner.
Right, and that makes sense. You should be able to knock out 50, 100 body weight squats if you are running for miles doing a mini single leg squats over and over and over again.
And what adaptation are you really getting from that, right? Like, that would be my question, is it's like, okay, so what is our, you get a good workout, but is that workout translating to more robustness as a whole? And for me, I feel like, no, probably not, I think lifting, slowing it down, less reps, heavier weight, and again, we're not talking like max percentages here. Like a lot of time, especially with the kids, when we're in season, I mean, these kids don't go over, generally 50, maybe 60% of their max effort from a weight perspective. And, especially when races are important, they're only lifting maybe 30, 35, 40% of their max effort weight. And, we're still stimulating what we need to stimulate, right? We're checking the appropriate strength boxes there. Doesn't need to be anything crazy, but they're doing that for 4 to 6, maybe 8 reps on certain lifts. They're not doing it for 25 or 20 reps.
Yeah, and I think a lot of, kind of what we're talking about is let's try to get you the best bang for your buck in your strength training. Let's tap into systems that you're not doing in your running. And let's do it in a way that complements your running, so that it doesn't just break down the system more. You're talking about building a more robust body that can tolerate the demands of running. And one thing that we know from an injury perspective is, you're talking about loading with actual challenging weight. Well, muscles and tendons, when they are injured, respond to loading, right? What they don't respond to is just constantly being stretched on and tugged on, or having really, really light resistance for many, many, many repetitions. That might be okay for a blood flow effect. But if you're trying to repair and heal that tendon, say Achilles or whatever that might be, shin splints or something, you need to load and you need to strengthen that tendon under a heavy load for less reps, more duration of holding that isometric to get that response. That all makes great sense.
And I think that's that kind of restorative nature of it, right? And then moving through these fuller ranges of motion, things like that. Many years ago, back to Simon and I, we had a very short-lived podcast together, where we were incredibly fortunate to interview some really awesome people for 6 or 7 episodes, and then we quit because we were, I don't know, we just were dumb. We should have kept it going. It was fun. But anyway, I think we got one turn down, and we were like, oh, we're out, we're done. That person said, no, we're never doing this again. But anyway, point being is we have Brian McKenzie on there, and Brian McKenzie is another guy who I've followed now for years and read his books and love his content. And so we got to talk to him, and I remember him kind of bringing up the point, or he said something to the effect of, kind of squatting, lifting, etc. And I've used this now for, since that, and that was, since that was probably 12 years ago, this conversation happened 10 years ago. Anyway, he said something to the effect of, that running is not like kind of a normative, it's not something that is restoring movement capacity, right? You're winding the system up. So then when we come in and, you and I both talk to people about warming up with working through full ranges of motion and cooling down, working through full ranges of motion. And then when we come in here and lift, we're working through as full of range of motion as they can,
quality,
as they can work through in a proficient manner. And he says that you are restoring movement capacity, right? Something along those lines is what he said to us, and restoring that movement capacity is something that we've really that I've hooked onto since the time he said that, and really restoring kind of that tissue function is a huge part of this, and again, that's where strength training becomes massively beneficial, is we can restore tissue function in a way that, again, running is an unbelievable form of exercise, and it does so much for us from a cardiorespiratory standpoint. But if you're doing it at a high level, and especially if you're trying to do it at a high level in a marathon, there's an insane amount of repetition that just, it's hard to argue is really quote unquote good for us, right? I think there's a lot of good that running can do for us, but a lot of that can be accomplished, in runs that are 1 hour and under, and most people that are running marathons are not running 1 hour under, for very much of their training, right? So they're mostly 1 hour and over, and that becomes highly repetitive. So we've got to think strategically and think, in ways that, for some runners may seem counter to what makes sense, but we've got to think in ways that are going to restore that tissue function.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to think about it, because,
that was actually the term that he used, was tissue function, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, you're taking the opportunity to, like you said, work through those full ranges of motion, allow the tissues to do what they're capable of doing, because when we're running, you're, like you said, it's extremely repetitive in a very short range of motion. You're not using the full capacity of your joints and your tissues that you have. And if you don't take that opportunity to do that, well, then what are you pairing together? You're sleeping in a relatively static position. Most people work a relatively static job or career. You sit at a desk or in a car or something, not using your tissues to their full range of motion. And then you run or you bike or you do some other endurance activity where you're just doing this highly repetitive, very small range of motion activity. And then our body starts to only know how to move in that pattern or in that range, right?
And just to say too, it's not that we never strength train in those ranges either, right? So one thing that we've incorporated in recent years in particular is strength training in ranges that look very akin to running. But it's not all of our strength training, right? We are still, for much of our strength training, we are focused on full ranges of motion. And then there are some aspects where we're going to say, especially again for some of these high level cross country runners we work with, we're going to look at that and say, okay, let's work very specifically on some very specific ranges of motion and strengthening these ranges of motion. But again, these are kids now who have worked with me for years and have really strong, they have a lot of good movement understanding at this point, and we're able to really kind of get into some more nuanced stuff. For most runners, I would argue that they don't probably need to worry about that right out of the gate. They just need to worry about getting some consistent quality strength training in, especially adult runners, in particular, just because so many of them, and you and I see them, we've been them, are broken. It's like, just running is hard. It's hard on the body. So,
well, and I'd like to preface this with, stay tuned for a future episode on this, because we will not have time to dive deep into this topic, because we're about to go coach a strength training class for runners, as a matter of fact. But one thing you just said, like, we've had injuries. A lot of endurance runners we've worked with have been like broken, dealt with chronic injuries over their running career. And what seems to be a trend that we're finding, right, is this concept of how you feel yourself and how you allow your body to repair from the demands of the activity that you're putting it through, by what you're putting into your body. And, we talked about goos and gels and stuff like during races, but to give like a very broad overarching theme, like what are some of the major problems that you see with runners from a nutrition standpoint? And from a really high level, like what are some of the highlights that you think runners should be trying to accomplish or change in their nutrition strategies, knowing that we can't like dive real deep into the weeds on this, but like what are some of the trends that you see and how you think people should go about trying to address these things?
We should definitely part 2 soon, or part 3, I guess, but because we should do a deep dive on this. But I think in a very general sense, the thing that you have heard, or well, I shouldn't say you have heard, we both talked to a lot of people about, but I probably blabber on a little bit more about, in a training sense, obviously, because that's, where I'm spending the majority of my time, is protein and the need for more protein. I think that a lot of runners are obsessed with, carbohydrate, which is great. And, I have experimented with so many different approaches to nutrition over the years. And like I said, next time, maybe let's dive down that rabbit hole and we can get into some good conversation there. I think all 3 of the macronutrients are highly important aspects of a runner's diet, protein, fat, and carbohydrates. But I think that we must get runners to think through the lens of protein first, in my opinion, because it is the building block, right? And it is what it's so much of the support. It's what supports the system. It's what supports regrowth and repairs, our broken down tissue. So, I think protein is probably the number one kind of general thing that I see, that a lot of runners are under proteined. A lot of people are under proteined. Again, this has been a big focus of what you and I talked to a lot of people about. So that would be one. And then I'd say 2 is probably just not enough food in general, is another thing. Again, I've probably been guilty of that in years past, as well. Playing with various approaches, but I think it's easy for runners to just be really fat adapted, for depending on what their diet's like. And if the more fat adapted you become, I have found that runners tend to have less appetite. And if that appetite isn't there and they don't have a good routine around what their food looks like every day, it's easy just to start skipping meals. And next thing you know, you're running, at a catabolic state that isn't supporting your system effectively at all. And you're just breaking down. So I would say, those are kind of the 2 main things right now that we're working on. And then just not like honestly, probably not. And I think there's a lot of nuance here and a lot of conversation to be had here. And I think we're talking about the running population specifically, because I have different feelings on these kind of topics based on the individual. But if we're talking about running populations in particular, it's not removing any macronutrient. It is that they are all a very important aspect of our life. And, I think there's, like I said, there's a lot of conversation to be had around, maybe somebody who's sedentary and is doing no exercise and, and kind of pulling some levers on macronutrients. There might be some benefit to looking at those things for them. But if we're talking about runners specifically, it is putting a huge priority around protein, and then not taking away from, the other thing too is I think kind of feeling out your own individuality around food too, like what you respond well to and what you don't. I think some runners do require a lot of carbohydrate to function at a high level, and I think some runners can function at a high level on less. I think very few runners can function on none, or very little, at a high level from a speed standpoint. Maybe ultra endurance stuff, there's a different conversation to have there. But I think if you're talking about, again, even up to the marathon and you're trying to run that fast, I think it's very difficult to do on very little carbohydrate. But I think some people, and I think I probably fall into this camp, can do it on, low to moderate amounts of carbohydrate. And other people, I've had training partners and friends over the years that eat way more carbohydrate than I do, and they're very fast. And so, point being is I think there's individuality there for sure. But if we're thinking again, kind of that broad general term, let's look at protein, let's look at overall caloric intake, making sure you're supporting that system, making sure you're supporting both performance and recovery.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, For all of you guys that tuned in to this episode with Tristan Mitchell to listen to us talk about Tristan's running career, strength training, nutrition for runners, stay tuned for a future episode where we're going to dive a bit more deeply into that fueling strategy conversation. But
let's get into fuel, I think, foot and ankle, we can talk about some of that stuff. And stable positions from a strength training standpoint, how they translate.
Absolutely.
I think those would be great topics. All things that I still want to talk about, but we've already been here for so long.
I think those things sound great, and I would like to get into those too. So please stay tuned for another episode on the code with Tristan where we can dive into those things. Now, if this episode brought up more questions for you, I would love for you guys to ask those. So in the show notes for this, you're going to see all of the contact information for Tristan Mitchell and for myself that you normally see. Please reach out to us if you have questions on these things. And then if this brought up some positive feelings for you, please go share those things in a review. You've heard me say this before. The way that we can keep this show going, get more awesome guests on here, and continue to spread this message to more and more people is to go leave those reviews, share the things that you enjoyed so that we can read those and make sure we keep getting episodes out that you want to hear about. Again, however you listen to this, thanks for being here. Tristan, thanks for being here.
Thanks,
we'll catch you guys next time on an episode of The Code. Thanks so much.